This video lecture is on Plato's Theaetetus. Now, the Theaetetus is actually, if there's a storyline here portrayed by Plato in his dialogues of Socrates' life, this occurs actually before the Euthyphro or the Apology, for example, before Socrates has actually gone to court. In this, he's kind of on his way to court. However, it actually was written after the Euthyphro and so on. Now, this dialogue is about the question, what is knowledge? So there are some questions to consider here then. If the dialogue is taking up this question, what is knowledge, if that is its central concern, right? One way to approach it is, again, as I've been saying, what is knowledge? But another way is, what does it mean to know something? How can we articulate that? Now, one thing about this is, what is knowledge is asking what is the essence, what is the nature of knowledge, right? So they are trying to get at that, again, like in the Euthyphro, that one thing of which, if it did not have it, it would not be knowledge, and if it does have it, all things that are knowledge have that one thing. So we can ask, one, why would one ask such a question? Because obviously this is not a question that someone is going to ask in their normal everyday lives when they're at work, when they're perhaps with friends, when they're making breakfast in the morning, right? There's something about this question which is not quite found in the everydayness of social life. Secondly, we can ask, what is then required to ask such a question? So, what is required to ask this question, what is knowledge? Which leads us to the third question then, what makes it philosophical? Because this, what we are pursuing, is not simply a question of, for example, science. Because while science might try to seek out knowledge, it is not asking what knowledge is. It already actually presumes an answer to this question of what is knowledge. So what is required to ask it then, what makes it philosophical? The translator for the version of the text I'm using for this, Joe Sachs, says that it is removing the ground from which you believe you are certain. That is what makes this a philosophical question, because it is going to try and inquire into things we take for granted and ask, okay, but what really is, when we talk about having knowledge, what does it really mean to have knowledge, right? What is kind of maybe beneath the surface in one way to think about, or what is the cause of this thing that we call knowledge? So again, right, already we're going into a domain which is not simply something which you can find in other disciplines, right? There's something where all things seemingly are up for grabs in this kind of philosophical question. Now, this text does actually have two other ones that follow it, where with this one, of course, with Theaetetus, right, the question is about what is knowledge. There's another text that follows it. This is called the Sophist, and this is how there can be such a thing as a false opinion. And then the one that follows that is known as the statesman. So what is it that's required to be a statesman? Now notice then we have these different domains. We have the statesman who, in one way, has a job to steer the polis towards the good and a just society. We have the sophist then, in learning about, well, what is it that the sophist, right, the faux philosopher, engages in? But notice, though, the Theaetetus' central concern is not what is philosophy, but what is knowledge. And so there's this question kind of left about this text, and to what role maybe, if there is no text on what is the philosopher, what insight can we get into that question, what is the philosopher, from this text, which a philosopher is one who loves wisdom. And as we see in this text, they say that knowledge should be equated with wisdom. Now, the way the text works is, first Socrates meets Theodoros. This is someone he knows and who teaches things like geometry and so on. Now, Theodorus speaks of a student of his named Theaetetus. And he says, oh, you've got to meet Theaetetus. He's a very, bright student of mine, and he actually looks like you. He resembles you. This leads Socrates to inquire into whether Theodorus could actually know that Theaetetus resembles Socrates' appearance, as Theodorus says, right? So, of course, this is probably something that would be taken for granted in normal conversation. If someone simply says, this person looks like you, you might think, oh, okay, or, well, I don't think so, right? But Socrates is going to take this opportunity, right? There's always some kind of setting, which is the point which they step off into the pursuit of this philosophical question. Well, how is it that Theodorus could really know whether or not Theaetetus resembles Socrates? Now, this leads then to Theaetetus actually being the primary one with whom Socrates is engaging in this question. And first, Theaetetus, in this question of what is knowledge, gives a preliminary definition. And Theaetetus says, well, knowledge is, the art of geometry or leather cutting or any other art of skill. This, as we'll see later, is not sufficient. And instead, after Socrates kind of explains what it is he's trying to do here, Theaetetus offers the first real definition of knowledge, and that is that knowledge is perception. Now, this also is shown to be incoherent eventually, which leads them to posit a second definition, that knowledge is true opinion. That as well is shown to be incoherent, or at least they cannot sufficiently explain whether or not this could really be true, that knowledge is true opinion, that it makes sense, leading them to the third definition, knowledge is true opinion with an articulation. So as you probably guessed, this also does not suffice. And this dialogue, like the other dialogues, ends in aporia, an impasse, a way which they cannot go forward. Now, in the introduction, when Theodorus states that he thinks Socrates and Theaetetus look alike, right? This question of, well, how do we know then Theodorus really knows appearances so well, has knowledge of appearances, not only of appearances, but then in the particular of Socrates' appearance and Theaetetus' appearance, that he can make such a statement like, I know that you two look alike. And Socrates compares this to asking as to whether we should trust one who says two instruments are tuned alike. How do we know that they have knowledge of, let's say, a guitar and a violin being tuned alike? Now we can ask, well, what if they're skilled in music, right? In one way, we come across this all the time. If we're going to say one who, if we're going to trust one who says that two instruments are tuned alike, we're going to likely do it because they're said to have some authority over this domain, right? They practice in this art, right? And likely, then, what does that mean? Well, typically they can teach it to other people. And those people then can take up that art as well and develop that skill. So, in the case of Theodorus, he is skilled in geometry and astronomy, calculation, music, and many other things. So Theodorus is said to be wise in these things of geometry and astronomy and so on because he teaches it to other people. Right? He demonstrates his knowledge. Well, because he demonstrates his knowledge to people like Theaetetus, then it is supposed learning must be a process of becoming wiser. That what it means to learn is to gain knowledge. And this is where they agree that one must know things to be wise, and that therefore knowledge and wisdom are understood to be the same thing. That one who is wise has knowledge, and vice versa. Now, we can say that knowledge and wisdom are the same thing, and remember Socrates is trying to scour Athens for the wisest person in Athens because he doesn't believe that he is the wisest person in Athens. And he's trying to figure out, well, who is this wise person, right? And then maybe in that way we can figure out an example of wisdom. So what then does it mean to have knowledge? Or another way of putting it is, what does it mean to have wisdom? So this is where then, after Theaetetus approaches Socrates and Theodoras, Socrates engages with Theaetetus in this conversation, and Theodoras is like, look, join in with Socrates. I know you're very smart. You can do this. You can have this conversation. Now, this is where Theaetetus offers what is known as the preliminary definition of knowledge, right? Socrates says, well, Theaetetus, you were so smart. Please indulge me in this conversation here. And Theaetetus says, well, both that the things one might learn from Theodoras are pieces of knowledge, geometry, for example, and what you went over just now, and also skill at leather cutting and the arts of the other craftsmen. Every one of these is nothing other than knowledge, right? So Theaetetus is saying here, well, someone who, is a craftsman, a carpenter, a musician, this is knowledge. Now, as we know from the Euthyphro, there's a problem here. What Theaetetus has just put forward is not the definition of knowledge. It is not the essence or the nature of knowledge, but instead, all Theaetetus has done is actually put forward examples or pieces of knowledge, and not what knowledge is itself, not what it means to have knowledge. And this is because, again, if I simply ask what is knowledge and you say, well, it's, being a carpenter, right? So demonstrating the skills of carpentry. Well, what if I come across a sailor? Does the sailor then not have knowledge because they're not a carpenter? Right? It's not universal enough to apply to all these other examples that might fit under the umbrella of the definition of knowledge. And there's an interesting question then that comes out of this that is asked, well, if a shoe craftsman, for example, doesn't know what knowledge is, do they have knowledge of shoemaking? And they admit yes. Even if the shoe craftsman cannot articulate what knowledge is, that doesn't mean they don't have knowledge of shoemaking. And here we get this split as to what it is they are after. They're not after, then, these particular cases of when then someone can demonstrate knowledge, but they are after the metaphysics of knowledge. They're after something that is taken for granted in the everydayness, that even those who are said to have knowledge of things might not be able to articulate then the essence of knowledge itself, which is then what is the role of the philosopher to do. So only the philosopher, right, would have knowledge of such a thing. Now, we get an argument for the role of Socrates in this text here, where he describes himself as a midwife, but not a midwife, of course, in real life who gives birth to actual human beings, but a different kind of midwife. So I'm going to read here from the text where Socrates explains this from 150b. And he says, but while everything else that belongs to their art of midwifery, women who help, other women give birth, belongs to their art of midwifery, belongs to mine. Mine differs by acting as midwife to men and not to women, and by looking to their souls when they are giving birth, and not to their bodies. Right? So Socrates then is not, of course, trying to facilitate, right, the role of some bodily function, but something of the soul. And here what is meant by soul is a little bit different than perhaps we could say in classical Christian philosophy or Islamic or Judaic philosophy, but instead the soul is kind of that principle of motion. It is that thing which allows one to kind of reach out and grasp logos, the essence of things. So in a sense, it is the mind, but it is not mind in a way that we would understand in a scientific sense. It's more than that. So continuing, he says, but the greatest thing in our art is this, to have the power to put to the test in every way whether the thinking of the young man is giving birth to something that is an image and false, or to something that is generated and true. And since this at least belongs to me just as it does to the midwives, that I am barren of wisdom, and the very thing belongs to me that many people have blamed me for before now, that I question others, but answer nothing myself about anything, on account of having nothing wise in me, what they blame me for is true. But the cause of this is the following. The God continually forces me to be a midwife, but each time prevents me from generating anything. So Socrates himself then cannot give birth to ideas, or cannot give birth to true ideas, shall we say, right? Which is why he goes around saying, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. But he says, but those who associate with me, while some of them at first appeared to be entirely without understanding, all, as the association goes on, if the God permits them, improve to a wonderful extent as it seems to them, and also to everyone else. And this is incandescently clear, that they do so, they improve like this, despite learning nothing from me ever, but by discovering and bringing forth many beautiful things themselves out of themselves. The midwifing, however, the God and I are responsible for. And this too is clear. Many people before now who didn't recognize this and held themselves responsible while they looked down on me, either went away themselves or were persuaded to by others earlier than they should have. And when they had gone away, they made what was left abort by bad company, and lost the things that had been midwived by me by rearing them badly, and made more of false things and images than of what was true. And when they were finished, they seemed to themselves and to everyone else to be without understanding. And so there's actually a little bit here of an allusion to the allegory of the cave, whereby one who has gone out of the cave and goes back in is seen by other ones to have kind of like lost their intelligence and be a little crazy. But there's something else Socrates has said here, which is he blames those people for leaving too soon and not allowing Socrates to fully facilitate them in the giving birth to true ideas. And this is very important, of course, because one, right, this is why he gets in trouble, because he seemed to have he's argued to corrupt the youth. But also, we know in many cases, like, again, the Euthyphro, where Euthyphro is like, look, I have to go, right? I don't have time to sit here and continue this conversation. And maybe it would get somewhere, right? But at least here Socrates is putting the blame on them and not on himself. Because again, it is not Socrates who brings the ideas to them, but helps facilitate them such that they bring the ideas out themselves. Now, Socrates also admits that this process of midwifing ideas is actually very painful. And he says, of course, it's not a kind of pain like women have. He says it's actually more. Now, I think one thing about this is that we can say it's potentially more in the sense that we know it's very difficult for people to admit when they are wrong, and it's very difficult for people to inquire into whether or not they have reason to believe the things they do believe. Now, whether or not then this is actually more painful than actually giving birth to a human being, I'll let actual people who give birth to human beings decide that. There is, however, this question that is left, and which is, how do we interpret this role then that Socrates says he provides, that of being a midwife to ideas? Now, there are potentially two ways. One is that it's reminiscent of the theory of recollection in the Meno, whereby Socrates helps, in a way, those people actually remember something that had been lost prior to them being born when they descended as souls from the realm of the forms. And so then Socrates helps them remember then true ideas which come from the realm of the forms, the truth. So is this like what goes on in the Meno? Well, there's another interpretation that no, it is not. And this is where I'll read from Joe Sachs, the translator for this edition I'm reading from. And Sachs says that commentators on the Theaetetus from the 1st or 2nd century AD to the 20th century have declared that the image of Socrates as a midwife is equivalent to the idea of recollection. But there's a new interpretation, someone by Jacob Klein, who has shown that the purpose of Socrates' midwifery is not to assist at the birth of insight, so the ability then to come to these true ideas, but instead the role of Socrates is to clear out the burden of opinions fathered by others. So Socrates then is not to help them in a way lead them down the path to the truth, but instead Socrates is to get them to kind of clear out then all the preconceived notions they have by listening to the opinions of others. And potentially this is true because what does Socrates do in this text? Well, he takes up opinions by those like, for example, Protagoras and Heraclitus. And so what happens is, as we see in this text, Socrates ends up showing that, well, the opinions by Protagoras and Heraclitus, people who are held in high regard by other Athenians, well, maybe then for Theaetetus to come to the true, he should get rid of then the power those other opinions by people in society have over him. And only once then has that been done, right, is it possible for them to come to true ideas. So Socrates is not leading them to the truth, but instead making it possible for them themselves to lead themselves to the truth. Now, after Socrates explains this and he kind of makes Theaetetus feel like, well, maybe I can come to then find the definition of what knowledge is, Theaetetus puts forward the first definition of knowledge. And he says that basically knowledge is perception. Quote, "So it seems to me that one who knows anything perceives that which he knows, and as it appears to me now at least, knowledge is nothing other than perception." So what is knowledge? It is perceiving. Now, how do we make sense of that, right? We're going to have to, we can't just accept someone stating that knowledge is perception, right? This is kind of a hunch here that Theaetetus has. So how do we go about actually demonstrating, articulating, if you will, what knowledge actually is? Well, they do this by Socrates saying, well, this sounds like actually something that Protagoras says. So they liken this definition that knowledge is perception to what Protagoras says, that, quote, "A human being is the measure of all things." A human being is the measure of all things. Now, of course, that would relate to that knowledge is perception, because it would be to say, well, what human beings perceive, then, that is what they know, that is what they judge, and that is what that thing is. They also think that this entails Heraclitus' theory that, quote, all is flux, that nothing ever is, but is always becoming. So here we have, on the one hand, to justify that knowledge is perception, an epistemological account of subjective relativism, that basically all knowledge is relative to the subject, in the case of Protagoras, that a human being is the measure of all things. And then we have also a metaphysical account to back up this statement, that of a fluctuating material monism, that everything, coming from Heraclitus, everything is all a modification of fire, so of motion, where everything is always flowing. So what they do from here then is to try to build up this argument, try to make sense of it. So we first get the famous cold wind argument by considering and trying to develop Protagoras' argument that a human being is the measure of all things. Socrates says, now aren't there times when, with the same wind blowing, one person shivers with cold and another doesn't? Or one does so slightly and another shivers violently? Well, shall we say that at such a time the wind itself, in itself, so the essence of the wind, is itself cold or not cold? Or shall we be persuaded by Protagoras that it's cold for the one who's shivering, but the wind is not cold for the one who is not shivering? So shall we basically say that it is either true that the wind is cold or it is not cold when two different people differ over that, or both the wind is cold, it is cold for the one who is shivering, and it is not cold for the one who is not shivering? This would mean, as they say, perception is always of what is, and being knowledge is without falsity then. So, in other words, perception is always of what is, not in the sense that perception is always of that, is always of what exists, but instead, perception is of the essence of things. Perception is always of that which is eternal and unchanging, of which then can be found, if we say the essence of what it means to be a chair, we perceive chairs because they contain that thing which makes all chairs chairs. And that then when we perceive things, we are perceiving them without falsity. Now, of course, since it's a contradiction for the wind to be simultaneously cold and warm, if we say that one and the same thing is both those things at the same time, that's a contradiction. That would mean any objectivism then must be abandoned. And they admit, well then, only relativized talk, if we are going to proceed with Protagoras' argument, only relativized talk makes sense. They then look at Heraclitus' theory of flux. So, since we cannot talk about the wind as it is, as if it exists as something permanent and unchanging, right, without motion, it's static or stable, they say then it must be the case that there are no stably existing objects with stably enduring qualities, right? Because if there are objects which exist stably with qualities that exist stably, then we could not say that human beings are the measure of all things, and that for one the wind is cold, it is true for one the wind is cold, and that for another it is true that the wind is not cold. Because we would be talking about one thing which would be stable in the quality of its coldness or its not being cold. But if it is the case that human beings are the measure of all things, they cannot have these stable qualities. They say, we say they are, not addressing them correctly since nothing ever is, but is always becoming. So they actually say when we speak, when we use language, we actually end up committing a mistake all the time by saying, the wind is cold, or they are happy. That we do that by saying are and is as if they are stable or static, unchanging, but instead they're saying really language betrays us if Heraclitus' theory is true, because nothing ever is, but it is always a process, it is always a becoming. And that, quote, motion produces what seems to be, that is, what becomes, while stillness produces non-being and perishing. Heat or fire, which is what both generates and is the guardian of everything else, is itself generated out of rushing and rubbing, and these are a pair of motions, right? So this is to back up Heraclitus' claim that everything, the essence of everything is fire. Right? So we get here then a kind of duality of passive and active motions. That if it seems like, well, some things, right, are active and they act on things which makes those then display certain qualities, right, that this might seem to make sense of how things then are always a process of becoming, and nothing is ever actually stable. That for some, this might be a chair, and for others, this might be a table, right, for example. Now, there are three theses that this theory implies. One is that qualities have no independent existence in time and space. That we cannot say something is true both today and 100 years in the future. right? And we can't say it's true whether it be in Nashville, Tennessee, or in Binghamton, New York. Secondly, that qualities do not exist in perception of them. That when we perceive those things, qualities do not exist simply in the perception of them. And the third thing is that changes in a thing's qualities are not so much changes in that thing as they are in the perceptions of that thing. So when we perceive things, right, we're not actually perceiving the thing as it really is, because there is no thing that that thing really is. According to Heraclitus then and Protagoras, if I perceive a cat, there is no cat that that thing really is. It is just a perception that is true for me, right? That we can't doubt then. We can't say, for example, if someone it says, oh, look, in the corner of the room, there's a pink hippo. We can't say that they're not really seeing a pink hippo, right? It is true that there is a pink hippo to them. Now, what then this theory implies, though, that we've been discussing, though, is that it does not mean that it's true that there really is a thing such as a pink hippo that is really there. Now, it also doesn't mean it's not true, but we just cannot simply make a definitive statement like that. Because, again, all things are in flux. All things are constantly changing, because that's the only way we can make sense that knowledge is perception, because knowledge is relative. Now, having then developed and trying to make sense of Protagoras' argument that human beings are the measure of all things, and Heraclitus' argument that the essence of all things is flux of change, we get then, by combining them, a more developed argument that knowledge is perception. And so here, Socrates shows how the exploration of Theaetetus' identification of knowledge with perception has led us to develop actually a whole kind of battery of views. And in particular, it has led us to develop a Protagorean doctrine of the incorrigibility of perception, that perception can never be wrong. And again, a Heraclitean account of what perception is. They say, quote, so we're left bound up together with one another, so that if anyone names anything, either as being or as becoming, it's necessary for him to say it is or it comes to be for someone or belonging to someone or relative to someone. But that there is anything in itself, either being or becoming, one must not either say oneself or accept when anyone else says it, as the account we've gone through indicates. So no one can say that something is true in and of itself, or that something is true universally, or that something is true for all time. They can only say it's true relative to something or to someone. Now, Socrates then begins to kind of point out, well, I'm not quite sure everything we've said makes sense. And of course, Protagoras, who was a friend of Theodoros, Theodoros is, not so sure about that. Like, wait, hold on, Socrates. Are you going to disparage my friend Protagoras and say what Protagoras has been saying is false? And Socrates says, well, no, I'm not someone who here has just all these ideas where I just spit out, well, on the other hand, there's this argument here that says this. And then, Protagoras said that, right? Socrates is earnestly on this pursuit to the truth of what knowledge is. And so it's not simply then trying to point out, well, on the other hand, there are opinions which contradict Protagoras. Now, what Socrates does point out, though, that what he sees is that it doesn't seem like there's a coherent way of applying Protagoras' relativism to opinions about the future. Now, there is a defense offered on behalf of Protagoras because Protagoras is not there. So what Socrates does is he basically parrots what it is that Protagoras might say in defense of that claim that there is no coherent way of applying Protagoras' argument about relativism to the future. So this is from 166b through d. Now, so this is supposed to be Protagoras here, defending himself. To start with, do you think anyone would go along with you that a memory that is present to him of things he experienced, when he's no longer experiencing them, is an experience of the same sort as he underwent at the time? Right? Protagoras is asking, well, wouldn't you agree that when someone perceives something in the moment, and then when they reflect on it, on their memory of that thing, that the perception is not quite the same? It's far short of it. Or next, that anyone would shrink from agreeing that it's possible for the same person to know and not know the same thing. Or even if he was afraid of this, that he will ever grant that one who's becoming unlike is the same person he was before becoming unlike. More than that, do you think he'll grant that this person is a him and not a them, with these becoming infinite, if in fact a process of becoming unlike is going on? That's if he's really going to need to be on guard against getting caught in the words going back and forth. But, you blessed one, he'll say, go up against the very thing that I say in a way more suited to a well-born man, if you have the power to, and prove that perceptions do not come privately to each of us, or that even though they do come privately, what appears would nonetheless come about for each person, would not come about for each person alone. Or if it has to be called being, that it would not be for just the one to whom it appears. So when you talk about a pig or a dog-faced baboon, not only are you being pig ignorant yourself, you also carry over the people who hear you to act this way toward my writings, which is no beautiful thing to do. I declare that the truth holds as I have written it, since each of us is a measure of the things that are and are not, and yet we differ one from another in thousands of ways for this very reason, that to one person some things are and appear, and to other persons, and to another person others do. And far from denying that there is wisdom in a wise man, I say that that very person is wise who, for any one of us to whom bad things appear and are, makes them change over into appearing and being good things. Right, so we get this one question here. Is a memory that is present to you of things past experienced when you're no longer experiencing them an experience of the same sort that underwent at that time? And of course, we would have to admit no, right? This is something that Hume actually admits. It's not quite the same experience, of course. If I am pinched right now and I then think later on about that pinching that happened in the past, my perception in the case of the feeling and then the memory is not the same thing. Then we have the second question. Are you the same person, or more accurately, are you not you all in a constant state of becoming that is remembering said experience? Since your experience of the being pinched, your knowledge of it, and then your knowledge of it in memory are different things. That there are actually perhaps an infinite number of selves that experience all the different things that occur, which is why your opinion can change. And the third question, would we say that someone who is sick and experiences food as bitter is unwise, while one who is healthy and experiences food as sweet is wise? Can we say such a thing about food in that case? Now, of course, Protagoras does not think so. Thus, he says, it's the case both that some people are wiser than others, and actually that no one has false opinions, and also that you, whether you like it or not, have to hold still for being a measure, for in these ways this account, his argument, is saved. So Protagoras here thinks he then has successfully defended his argument that a human being is the measure of all things, that no one is ever wrong in their perception, and yet some people are wiser than others still. Now, Protagoras may perceive his claim as true, of course, right? But others may not, and each has an equally valid claim on their perception. That, too, is something that is part of Protagoras' argument here, and that's going to come back to haunt Protagoras. They say, for to examine appearances and opinions that belong to one another, and try to refute them, when what belongs to each person is correct, isn't that a lot of resounding and bubbleheadedness if the truth of Protagoras is true? So what Socrates just asks is, well, hold on, if Protagoras, right, he just made this case, right, that his argument is true, can't someone else just simply perceive it as being false? And it's true for them that Protagoras' argument is false. So, to try to think about this, they ask this question about when we hear a foreign language. Does one know what they hear? Right? So if you are raised in the United States, you're likely to be raised learning English, potentially, Spanish as well, or a number of different languages. But we'll just say in the United States, you're raised learning English, and let's say then you hear someone speaking a different language, potentially Spanish. Well, you can't be said to be not perceiving that foreign language because you're hearing something, right? You're hearing that someone is speaking something. Well, since you're hearing that language, can you be, and it's perhaps Spanish, can you then be said to know Spanish, even if you were never taught Spanish and you had never actually heard Spanish before, but you're hearing it now? Wouldn't Protagoras' account mean that simply because I perceive it, since if we were to say that knowledge is perception, that since I'm perceiving through my ears, right, a foreign language, I know that foreign language? That would seem to be a bit absurd, right? So we're left asking these questions. How is what they perceive different from one who knows that language? And if I don't know what's being said, do I not then perceive, sense, or hear it? These are consequences of the argument put forward that knowledge is perception. These are consequences that are starting then to show that maybe this definition of knowledge is not coherent. Right? So to see is to perceive, right? And perception then is supposed to be knowledge. But we can ask, but does one who remembers something in the past not know that very thing they once saw, right? But does not currently? Because if we say there are only 5 senses, right? Seeing, tasting, smelling, and hearing, and feeling or touch, memory is not a perception. It's not one of the 5 senses. So if I am not currently perceiving the arguments that I've, had been reading in the Theaetetus, then do I not know the arguments in the Theaetetus? Right? Now we're starting to ask, well, wait a second, what role does memory play in knowledge then? So we have here this kind of claim that, but is not seeing means does not know, if in fact then sees means knows. So is not seeing. To not see would mean then to not know, if in fact to see means to know. And so anything I'm not currently seeing, I do not know then, would be another consequence of Protagoras' argument. We then get this final objection to Protagoras, and this is really the kind of ultimate, basic, the one that everyone always goes back to whenever they try to refute relativism. The problem, ultimately, with Protagoras' argument that a human being is the measure of all things is that Protagoras must end up finding his own statement false. Now, Socrates explains this by considering whatever each city or culture decides to be true, according to Protagoras' argument, it must be true for them. So, if a city decides, you know what, it's the custom that 2 plus 2 equals 5, well then it must be true that 2 plus 2 equals 5. because again, that's how they perceive it. The same must be then for humanity as a whole, that, well then, whatever is kind of the basic thing that human beings might do, then it's true for human beings. And Socrates actually then adds this extra interesting claim that there are almost always more people who are against something than who are in favor of something. Right? And that doesn't mean that they embrace the opposite of that thing, but they dispute it. And that's probably true, right? Think of something that you think is true. If you were to go out and ask 100 people if they agree with you about that thing, right? Let's say that the Tennessee Titans are the best football team. You're probably going to find more people who disagree than agree. Let's even say that, Christianity is the correct religion, for example. Let's go around the world and ask everyone. You're going to find more people who don't agree and embrace some opposite religion, all the one same religion, but there are going to be more people who dispute that than agree with it. And that would mean, according to Protagoras' own statement, then it would have to be true whatever the majority agreed to. So that would mean then, if a majority of people in Athens, say, disagree that with Protagoras' argument that a human being is the measure of all things, then it must be true, as if Protagoras is an Athenian citizen, that for Protagoras true, his own statement is false. And that's the problem with relativism. That anytime something is true, it can simultaneously be false. If it is relative, I can say, well, it's relative to me because this is what I think. But then we can look bigger at society, and society might disagree. So then it would be simultaneously, if we only think about me, true. Then we look at society. Well, if I'm a member of society, then it must be false for me as opposed to being true for me. And so that means for Protagoras also that they say, then since it is disputed by everyone, the truth of Protagoras will be true for no one, not for anyone else, and not even for himself. So that therefore, for Protagoras, his own argument must be false, even for himself. Because if human beings are the measure of all things, and it turns out more people disagree with that statement itself, well, human beings have seemingly decided, and they've decided it is false. So Protagoras must take his own statement to be false. We then see objections to Heraclitus. For Heraclitus, you can consider, again, right, that argument about becoming, that all things then are in a process of motion, and they never are stable, lasting things. We get this argument then about two forms of motion. Motion in terms of alteration, so a thing itself, maybe the quality of it changing, and then we get motion through a change of place. And so all things must be moving with all motions simultaneously, both altering and change of place. So in perceiving then, something is acting, and something acted upon, which becomes perception. As we see here with this argument from 182c, Socrates says, then are they, in both the kinds of motions that we distinguish, being carried along and altering? Theodorus says, how could they not, if indeed they're to be wholly in motion? So Socrates says, then if they were only carried along and did not alter, we would presumably have a way to say what sorts of things are in flux, namely the ones being carried along. Or how do we mean it? And Theodorus says, well, that way. So Socrates says, but since not even this stays still, that claim that all things are in flux, that as an idea also must be in flux, that it's the flowing white that's flowing, considering the color white when perceiving something white, so that even of this, of the whiteness itself when we're perceiving, say, of a whiteboard, there's a flux and a change into another color in order that it may not be caught staying still in this way? Is it ever possible to address it as any color so as to give it a name correctly? Right? If all things are in motion, how can I ever assert that that thing is a whiteboard? Or that this page on this book is the color white. It has a whiteness to it. And what are we to say about perception of any sort whatever, such as about seeing or hearing? Does it ever stay still as just seeing or hearing? Right? Is there anything that is a entirely separate thing that is seeing as opposed to hearing? Well, if all things are in flux, then it would have to be both, that it is seeing, but then all of a sudden you're hearing it. You're not actually seeing, you're hearing it. But then you're not hearing it, you're touching it, right? Because there can't be anything stable that is such a thing as hearing, or seeing, or feeling, or perceiving even. Therefore, one must not attach the name of seeing to it any more than not seeing, nor of any other sort of perception, more so than not, if all things are in motion in all ways, as Heraclitus claims. Therefore, when we were asked what knowledge is, we ended up answering, by using Heraclitus' own argument, we ended up answering no more about knowledge than about non-knowledge. It seems, therefore, that it showed that if all things are in motion, as Heraclitus supposes, every answer, no matter what one is answering about, is equally correct in claiming that it's this way or not this way. Or if you wish, it becomes, in order that we not stop them in our speech. So, quite simply then, if Heraclitus' argument is true, then no assertion whatever can properly be made. Not even then that claim that knowledge is perception, because if all things are in flux, there is no essence to that claim that knowledge is perception. There would be no essence to knowledge to say that it is perception, because it would be simultaneously perception and not perception. So, A, Heraclitus' theory of flux no more helps prove that knowledge is perception than that knowledge is not perception, and B, one cannot coherently say anything at all, not even to state their own doctrine. So, sadly, both Protagoras and Heraclitus cannot be used for the argument that knowledge is perception. And because this was kind of the foundation here of this argument that Theaetetus put forward, it would seem then that knowledge is not perception. If there is such a thing as knowledge, it must be true. It must be something that is predictive of the future and not mere opinion, because if it is going to be something true that has a nature to it, it would not then be different in the future. It would be the same. Right? Which is why, again, science proceeds according to this a similar kind of model of a definition of knowledge that, well, what they seek is predictability in their theories. Right? So Protagoras must be wrong on this account. And then Heraclitus must be wrong, because knowledge must have being. It must have an enduring determinateness, which means that the essence is something stable, and it is not a process of becoming. So, knowledge cannot simply be perception. Because perception, again, entails this kind of a process of change, and perception includes a certain amount of relativity. Now, I think this does lead to an interesting question to consider, because there is a clear role that that perception plays when we consider whether or not someone knows something, or whether or not we would believe something, and therefore if we typically believe something, we say we have knowledge of that thing. Right? So there's a common saying that to see is to believe. Now, based on what we've seen so far in the Theaetetus, and this considering and then refutation of this first definition of knowledge, that knowledge is perception, what might we make of such a claim that this common saying that to see is to believe. Would we outright say that this claim is false and no one should say that to see is to believe? Or is there a role this claim plays, maybe, that maybe plays a kind of middle role between simply saying that it's outright false, right? And that there's maybe a kind of a common way that such a claim would play. And I think this is an interesting question because there's a certain way in which, in this text, the Theaetetus, the question as to what knowledge is being considered in many ways as to the common account of when we say whether or not someone knows something or doesn't know something. Because there's a little bit of a difference in, we might say, a more academic or technical setting, like you see when this is considered in the Republic with the divided line and the allegory of the cave, where with the philosopher, they are not considering common everyday accounts of knowledge, but of the true essence of knowledge according to the theory of the forms, which is an abstract ideal thing, right? And in a way, in this text, we are considering kind of concrete everyday accounts of the definition of knowledge. So what kind of role then would that play as to the common saying, to see is to believe? What do we make of this saying then, in light of what we just discussed with this first definition, that knowledge is perception?